Hello possums, Hardcore Castle. But today we are not staying up at the castle. I promised you we were going to talk about medieval bread making, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to head out and I am going to make a mill and a bakehouse so that our villagers can have their daily bread. Let's get going. Just a quick word before we start. If you hear me say corn during this video, I do not mean maize. Corn was a word used by the English to refer to all types of grain, wheat, barley, rye, oats, whatever it was. And when they got to the New World, they saw another type of grain, which was maize, and they called that corn too. And for some reason, that's been stuck with the name. So if I say corn, I don't mean this, I mean this. Because we've got this lovely pond here, I'm building a watermill today. There were different types of mill. Lots of people build windmills in Minecraft. Windmill tech started to appear in Britain in the late 12th century, whereas watermills date from Romano Britain and continued to be built into the early 20th century. There were several types of watermill, the first distinction being a horizontal or vertical wheel. Vertical came in three forms: overshot, undershot, and breastshot, which is halfway. There was also the tide mill set on the coast and using the ebb and flow of the tides to power the wheel. Horizontal wheels had largely disappeared from England by the 13th century, replaced by the larger vertical wheels, but they continued to be used in other parts of the British Isles, and I've decided to go with a horizontal just for something different. Most mills were for grinding corn or grain, although they could also be used for ore crushing, cloth fulling, bark crushing, a whole lot of industrial activities. Another way to grind small amounts of grain was with a quern, which was sort of a small personal millstone. It was hard work, and querns were not really suitable for grinding grain for bread, as they only produced small quantities of flour at a time, and many querns couldn't grind finely. But they would be good enough to grind oats or barley for porridge or pottage. By the way, I'll bet up at the castle the Lord's quern could grind finely. So you take your grain to the mill to be ground into flour. Doesn't sound so bad. It's ground better and more easily than with a quern, except that you have to pay a fee to have your grain ground. The fee was known as a multure, from the Latin molitus, have ground, and was usually 1/16 of the grain or of the finished flour. The multure was collected by the miller or by a multurer, and is fair enough when you consider that millstones were highly specialised and quite expensive to obtain and install. And there were maintenance costs associated with the mill as well. The owner of the mill, the lord or the church, wanted a return on their community investment, so everyone was required to get their grain milled at the mill. Depending where you were and who it was you owed fealty to, you may be able to use a quern for your daily grind for the small amounts. However, some lords and some church institutions refused permission for any home grinding, and being caught with a quern would result in confiscation of same and probably a fine, if not worse. The floor of the parlour of St Albans Abbey in England was made of confiscated querns. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the abbey was attacked for many fair and sound reasons, and amongst other actions, the parlour floor was pulled up and all the stones smashed. And there's our mill. Now, I've started making a path from the mill down to the village. I haven't quite finished it. I need to make another shovel. But let's just talk about the parts of the mill before we head over and start on the bakehouse. Well, not so much the parts of the mill as the landscape around it. Now, if you are building on a sloped landscape, I would seriously swap out a horizontal mill wheel for a vertical one, because there are all sorts of ways that you could make transition of landscape so much easier with a mill. So above the mill, you've got the mill stream. Now that could be made up of several different components, or it could just be a stream straight down. Now we have water coming down from here. We've got a little bit of a mill pond, and then we've got the mill race. That's the bit of the mill stream that's just above the mill. We've got the wheel race, which flows in past the mill wheel. What a surprise. And then we've got the tail race, which is below the mill wheel. and it heads out into the rest of the body of water. In our case, it's a second mill pond. So then if we come up here, we've got the grindstone. And yeah, I know this should be round. It's Minecraft, give me a break. And we've got a hopper. And yet that's a hopper, but it was a hopper. It's probably more likely made of wood than metal. But you put your grain in here, it gets dropped into the grindstone, and it comes out round here. And I shouldn't have naked flames in here. Flour is highly flammable. But I don't want mobs in here, so we've got naked flames. Let's just let that go. So that's our mill. Let's take our flour and head back to the village and see what happens when we want to make some bread. So bakehouses. Bakehouses also belong to the Lord or to the church and were run by a baker. Some bakehouses were in castles or attached to monasteries, but most were situated within villages and were centrally located. No one was allowed to bake their own bread. Instead, they were required to bring their dough to the bakehouse and pay another fee to have it baked. This fee was called a banality, which could be paid in coin or in kind. A ban was an edict or an order. It could be for or against something. A banality was a fee that was ordered and seems to have particularly been associated with bread baking. You bring your ingredients, you pay to bake the bread, you take your bread home every day. As well as baking the daily bread, bakers could also produce extra bread for general sale. Bread was largely unleavened, so our flat loaves here are wholly appropriate. And different classes ate different breads, and bakers were required to produce all of these. Remember our horse bread? That's at the bottom of the scale. At the top was the finest and whitest bread reserved for the lord or the senior local church person. Millers and bakers did quite well for themselves when times were good, but suffered reputations as thieves and cheats. I'm sure some were, but how many others were merely the targets of frustration? You work your lord's land as part of your rent. You work so many days a week on church land for free as well as paying a tithe. You are required to have your grain ground at the mill for a fee, and then you are required to pay to have your bread baked. No home baking allowed, not even in times of hardship. And the people you faced, the people you had to hand over payment to, were the miller and the baker, rather than the lord or the abbot or whoever it was who kept those fees and handed out punishments. So here's the finished bakery for our poor baker. Let's have a look inside. We've got racks for the bread to prove on. There's our little unleavened loaves. They look quite nice. And if you've noticed, we'll come back out. I'm terrible like this, aren't I? We've got a chimney. The baker and the blacksmith. They're the two professions that require chimneys. No one else has really got them at this stage. And if you notice, the chimney, and just pretend that goes up, is in front of the oven, not over the oven. Because you light a fire in here and you let it heat the oven up, and all the warmth gets stored in the oven itself, in the bricks, in the clay. And when it's ready, you scrape all the fire out, you put the bread in, you close the door, and all the smoke from this has to go somewhere. So that's our bakery. I'll have to work out which of these houses is for the baker and which is for the miller. Possibly that one and maybe this one, I'm not sure. I'll work it out. While the bread's baking, I've got end cards on the screen to some more of my videos, and if you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. What's your favourite type of bread? Okay, see you next video. Bye!